Thanks. Yep. My name is Patrick Brown. I'm co-director of Energy and Climate at the Breakthrough Institute and still have a loose affiliation with the Wildfire Interdisciplinary Research Center. And so the topic here is the potential for fuel reduction to offset climate warming impacts on wildfire intensity in California. And we're looking at this topic in the context of operational models of fire danger and prediction tools. And so just the background here is, climate warming is increasing wildfire danger in California, as exemplified by this, fourfold increase in area burned in California. And so we think that this is, at least partially driven by warming, as shown here by observations in black and climate model projections in red. And the mechanism is, as we heard about in the last talk, that warming induces a larger vapor pressure deficit, which it increases fuel aridity or decreases fuel moisture. And so we're looking at the potential for fuel reduction to offset this warming, because this warming is going to be we're going to have warming the rest of the century, basically, regardless of the emission scenario. And so when I say fuel reduction, I'm specifically talking about things like mechanical thinning and prescribed burning. So this is shown here in some pictures, some fuel reduction on a brush landscape and fuel reduction in a more forested landscape. So we're going to try to represent that in the modeling. And the main reason to look at this question is that this is the main mitigation tool that's being proposed by California's Wildfire and Forest Resilience Action Plan. So the main goal here in the proposal is to scale up fuel reduction and forest management on 1 million acres of California landscape per year, and that's split roughly 500,000 between CAL FIRE and 500,000 with the U.S. Forest Service. And so basically what we have is fuel and temperature are independent variables, and we're interested in those influences on wildfire intensity. So our response variable here is fire radiative power, which we look at through the VIIRS satellite. So we basically want to empirically learn the relationships between fuel and temperature, which we filter into aridity, and then conditional on all sorts of other environmental parameters like wind, precipitation, and topography. And we're looking at this, which for a climate study at least, is a very novel combination of the number of observations, the resolution. So we're using 0.5 kilometer spatial resolution and hourly temporal resolution. We're using a lot of fuel characteristics, so 6 attributes of surface fuels and 4 attributes of forest canopy characteristics. We're using 3 months of antecedent weather conditions. This is over, the entire state of California, so large spatial extent, large temporal extent for our observational training period. And we're using machine learning, so random forests and neural networks to learn the relationships between fuel and temperature and fire radiative power. So just a little more on where the fuel component comes from. So we're taking the Scottenbergen models provided by Landfire and just using the standard fuel model parameters for those fuel loads to get spatially explicit maps of 1, 10, 100-hour live woody, live herbaceous fuel loads, as well as fuel bed depth. So those are our 6 surface fuel characteristics. And then we also use the Landfire data set for the forest canopy characteristics. So forest canopy cover percentage, canopy height, canopy base height, and canopy bulk density. So those are 10 fuel characteristics. And then for the climate or temperature component, we're taking temperature and we're doing some feature engineering here. We're combining that with precipitation and absolute moisture of the atmosphere to get a calculation of 1, 10, 100, and 1,000-hour dead fuel moisture percentage. So these are our 16 predictors for wildfire intensity or fire radiative power. So we also have wind speed and slope in there. And so this validates on out of training sample data pretty well. So p-values of 0, basically below machine precision. And it looks pretty good, especially when you kind of go to higher levels of aggregation. So over here is in time, looking at observed versus predicted fire radiative power at the monthly time scale. And so then you're getting up to correlations of 0.9. So pretty good, especially considering that this doesn't have any information on, for example, fire suppression or a bunch of other things you could think about which would affect fire radiative power. But obviously these variables do constrain it to a pretty good degree. So the whole study is basically 3 steps. So I've just been describing this first step, which is learn relationships. So combine the high resolution fuel data, weather data, and VIIRS remotely sensed fire intensity data to learn these relationships between the environmental conditions and fire intensity. And then the next 2 steps are we extrapolate in space. So we use these relationships to drive statewide fire intensity potential maps for hours that were particularly consequential in our data set. So we're looking just right at that hour resolution. And then we make future projections. We basically take these maps and we place them into future climate scenarios, and then with and without reduced fuel loads to see how the fire intensity potential changes. So here's what it looks like, the extrapolation in space step. So we call these fire intensity potential maps. And the potential part is because it's what the machine learning models would predict the fire radiative power would be at that pixel, if there was a fire present. So that's why it's potential, given all of the 16 predictors. And so this is for basically our most consequential hour in our data set. So this is September 8th, 2020 in the afternoon. And so this is like as severe as our maps get. So then we're taking those maps and we're putting them in hypothetical futures. So we need to alter the climate and alter the fuel scenarios to answer our questions. So to alter the climate, what we're doing is we're taking Cordex temperature projections, so that's a dynamically downscaled climate model temperature projection, and filtering that through the dead fuel moisture calculation. So basically, you're looking at today, 2050, 2090, for any given conditions during an hour or during a fire, you're basically getting reduced dead fuel moisture percentages in the future when it's warmer. And then for the fuel scenarios, what we're doing is we're within each Scottenbergen category, anything that's above the 1 gets knocked down to 1. That's how we're simulating the fuel reduction. So if the 1 hour GRASS 4 model has 0.25 for its fuel load, that gets knocked down to 1 in the post-treatment scenario. And so that's the case for all categories within each category for grass shrub, and the timber categories. And so that's what this looks like in terms of maps if you were to do fuel reduction across the entire state. And we also do this, we have just proportional fractions that we're multiplying to get reduced fuel cover and then increased canopy base height and decreased bulk density. And so, of course, it's not realistic to do fuel reduction across the entire state. So we look at this as a fraction of area treated. So kind of starting with where you get the most bang for your buck, we're looking at 200,000 acres a year, 400,000 acres a year, 800,000 acres a year, and 1.6 million acres per year. Again, prioritized by where the fire intensity actually decreases the most from doing the fuel reduction. Okay, so this is basically the main results. So this is looking at the 30 most consequential hours in our historical data set. And so historically, what this is saying is that the average fire intensity potential was about 560 megawatts across the state for those 30 hours. And then we're looking at 2 periods in the future, so a 2050 and 2090 period. And we're looking at 2 different greenhouse gas emission scenarios. So one is a slower emissions reduction scenario. So that's a RCP 4.5 emissions reduction scenario. And then one is a fast emissions reduction scenario, much more in line with the Paris Agreement. So it's RCP 2.6. And so what you see is that as it's warming, this is with no fuel reduction, you get increased fire intensity potential, so 25% increase by the end of the century. And if you reduce, emissions globally from this slow emissions to faster emissions, you're getting some response to that. You're cutting from 25% to plus 16%, but it's not that big of a difference. And especially it's not a very big difference by 2050. But if you're to do fuel reduction, this is not the universal scenario. This is actually just a 1.6 million acres per year scenario. If you are able to scale that up, that actually is making this huge difference. So now you're talking about more than a 10% reduction in average fire intensity potential by 2050, even under the slow emissions reduction scenario. And even at the end of the century, you're looking at a reduction in fire intensity potential relative to today. And that's for 1.6 million acres per year. That's assuming a 5-year return period. But it's like not that crazy, right? Because this is the goal, the articulated goal is 1 million acres per year. So it's 60% more than that. So I think one of the takeaways here is when you look at these two sets of lines, is that the impact of increasing fuel reduction to the scales similar to the state's articulated goal has a much larger impact on statewide wildfire intensity potential than the globe increasing its greenhouse gas emissions reductions to those articulated goals. So I'm saying that the difference between these two lines and these two lines is smaller than the difference between the two sets of lines. And then this is, even under slow emissions reductions, we can see reduced wildfire intensity in 2090 relative to today, according to this modeling. And something that's cool about this, because it's operational, is that we can look at specific case studies basically in real time. And so this is one that I did with the previous LA fires in September, so the bridge, line, and airport fires, which are more relevant to this question because all three of those were burning in national forests, right? Angeles, San Bernardino, and Cleveland National Forest. But we can see what the models predict in terms of fire intensity potential in black here. So, there's a lot of variability just from the diurnal cycle and just from the changes in conditions. And then what you're seeing here in red and magenta is the same weather sequence placed in 2050 conditions or temperature conditions without fuel reduction. And then the blue line is 2050 temperature conditions under the slow emissions reduction scenario, but with fuel reduction applied. So you're getting, again, a reduction in fire intensity potential relative to today, not just relative to the warmer future without fuel reduction. So this is, if you want to read more about this, this is a preprint on Earth Archive, but it should also be published in environmental research letters this week or next week, sometime very soon. So thanks.